Chapter 22. The Holy Fountain. The pilgrims were human beings. Otherwise they would have acted differently. They had come a long and difficult journey, and now when the journey was nearly finished, and they learned that the main thing they had come for had ceased to exist, they didn't do as horses or cats or angleworms would probably have done, turn back and get at something profitable. No. Anxious as they had before been to see the miraculous fountain, they were as much as 40 times as anxious now to see the place where it had used to be. There is no accounting for human beings. We made good time, and a couple of hours before sunset we stood upon the high confines of the Valley of Holiness, and our eyes swept it from end to end and noted its features. That is, its large features. These were the three masses of buildings. They were distant and isolated temporalities shrunk into toy constructions in the lonely waste of what seemed a desert and was. Such a scene is always mournful, it is so impressively still, and looks so steeped in death. But there was a sound here which interrupted the stillness only to add to its mournfulness. This was the faint, far sound of tolling bells which floated fitfully to us on the passing breeze, and so faintly, so softly, that we hardly knew whether we heard it with our ears or with our spirits. We reached the monastery before dark, and there the males were given lodging, but the women were sent over to the nunnery. The bells were close at hand now, and their solemn booming smote upon the ear like a message of doom. A superstitious despair possessed the heart of every monk and published itself in his ghastly face. Everywhere, these black-robed, soft-sandaled, tallow-visaged specters appeared, flitted about and disappeared, noiseless as the creatures of a troubled dream, and as uncanny. The old abbot's joy to see me was pathetic. Even to tears, but he did the shedding himself. He said, "Delay not, son, but get to thy saving work. And we bring not the water back again, and soon we are ruined, and the good work of 200 years must end. And see thou do it with enchantments that be holy, for the church will not endure that work in her cause be done by devil's magic. When I work, Father, be sure there will be no devil's work connected with it. I shall use no arts that come of the devil, and no elements not created by the hand of God. But is Merlin working strictly on pious lines?" "Ah, he said he would. My son, he said he would, and took oath to make his promise good." "Well, in that case, let him proceed. But surely you will not sit idle by, but help. It will not answer to mix methods, Father, neither would it be professional courtesy. Two of a trade must not underbid each other. We might as well cut rates and be done with it. It would arrive at that in the end. Merlin has the contract, no other magician can touch it till he throws it up. But I will take it from him it is a terrible emergency, and the act is thereby justified. And if it were not so, who will give law to the church? The church giveth law to all in what she wills to do, that she may do, hurt whom it may. I will take it from him, you shall begin upon the moment. It may not be, Father, no doubt, as you say, where power is supreme. One can do as one likes and suffer no injury, but we poor magicians are not so situated. Merlin is a very good magician in a small way, and has quite a neat provincial reputation. He is struggling along, doing the best he can, and it would not be etiquette for me to take his job until he himself abandons it." The abbot's face lighted. "Me? Ah, that is simple. There are ways to persuade him to abandon it. No, no, Father, it skills not, as these people say. If he were persuaded against his will, he would load that well with a malicious enchantment, which would balk me until I found out its secret. It might take a month. I could set up a little enchantment of mine which I call the telephone, and he could not find out its secret in 100 years. Yes, you perceive, he might block me for a month. Would you like to risk a month in a dry time like this?" "A month. The mere thought of it maketh me to shudder. Have it thy way, my son. But my heart is heavy with this disappointment. Leave me, and let me wear my spirit with weariness and waiting, even as I have done these 10 long days, counterfeiting thus the thing that is called rest, the prone body making outward sign of repose, where inwardly is none." Of course, it would have been best, all round, for Merlin to waive etiquette, and quit, and call it half a day, since he would never be able to start that water. For he was a true magician of the time, which is to say, the big miracles, the ones that gave him his reputation, always had the luck to be performed when nobody but Merlin was present. He couldn't start this well with all this crowd around. To see a crowd was as bad for a magician's miracle in that day as it was for a spiritualist's miracle in mine. There was sure to be some skeptic on hand to turn up the gas at the crucial moment and spoil everything. But I did not want Merlin to retire from the job until I was ready to take hold of it effectively myself, and I could not do that until I got my things from Camelot, and that would take 2 or 3 days. My presence gave the monks hope, and cheered them up a good deal, insomuch that they ate a square meal that night for the first time in 10 days. As soon as their stomachs had been properly reinforced with food, their spirits began to rise fast. When the mead began to go round, they rose faster. By the time everybody was half seas over, the holy community was in good shape to make a night of it, so we stayed by the board and put it through on that line. Matters got to be very jolly. Good old questionable stories were told that made the tears run down and cavernous mouths stand wide, and the round bellies shake with laughter, and questionable songs were bellowed out in a mighty chorus that drowned the boom of the tolling bells. At last I ventured a story myself, and vast was the success of it. Not right off, of course, for the native of those islands does not, as a rule, dissolve upon the early applications of a humorous thing, but the 5th time I told it, they began to crack in places. The 8th time I told it, they began to crumble. At the 12th repetition they fell apart in chunks, and at the 15th they disintegrated, and I got a broom and swept them up. This language is figurative. Those islanders, well, they are slow pay at first, in the matter of return for your investment of effort, but in the end they make the pay of all other nations poor and small by contrast. I was at the well next day betimes. Merlin was there, enchanting away like a beaver, but not raising the moisture. He was not in a pleasant humor, and every time I hinted that perhaps this contract was a shade too hefty for a novice, he unlimbered his tongue and cursed like a bishop, French bishop of the Regency days, I mean. Matters were about as I expected to find them. The fountain was an ordinary well. It had been dug in the ordinary way and stoned up in the ordinary way. There was no miracle about it. Even the lie that had created its reputation was not miraculous. I could have told it myself, with one hand tied behind me. The well was in a dark chamber which stood in the center of a cut stone chapel, whose walls were hung with pious pictures of a workmanship that would have made a chromo feel good, pictures historically commemorative of curative miracles which had been achieved by the waters when nobody was looking. That is, nobody but angels. They are always on deck when there is a miracle to the fore, so as to get put in the picture, perhaps. Angels are as fond of that as a fire company look at the old masters. The well chamber was dimly lighted by lamps. The water was drawn with a windlass and chain by monks, and poured into troughs which delivered it into stone reservoirs outside in the chapel when there was water to draw. And none but monks could enter the well chamber. I entered it, for I had temporary authority to do so, by courtesy of my professional brother and subordinate. But he hadn't entered it himself. He did everything by incantations. He never worked his intellect. If he had stepped in there and used his eyes, instead of his disordered mind, he could have cured the well by natural means, and then turned it into a miracle in the customary way. But no, he was an old numbskull, a magician who believed in his own magic, and no magician can thrive who is handicapped with a superstition like that. I had an idea that the well had sprung a leak, that some of the wall stones near the bottom had fallen and exposed fissures that allowed the water to escape. I measured the chain -98 feet. Then I called in a couple of monks, locked the door, took a candle, and made them lower me in the bucket. When the chain was all paid out, the candle confirmed my suspicion. A considerable section of the wall was gone, exposing a good big fissure. I almost regretted that my theory about the well's trouble was correct, because I had another one that had a showy point or two about it for a miracle. I remembered that in America, many centuries later, when an oil well ceased to flow, they used to blast it out with a dynamite torpedo. If I should find this well dry and no explanation of it, I could astonish these people most nobly by having a person of no especial value drop a dynamite bomb into it. It was my idea to appoint Merlin. However, it was plain that there was no occasion for the bomb. One cannot have everything the way he would like it. A man has no business to be depressed by a disappointment. Anyway, he ought to make up his mind to get even. That is what I did. I said to myself, I am in no hurry. I can wait, that bomb will come good yet. And it did too. When I was above ground again, I turned out the monks and let down a fish line. The well was 150 feet deep, and there was 41 feet of water in it. I called in a monk and asked, "How deep is the well?" "That, sir, I wit not, having never been told." "How does the water usually stand in it?" "Near to the top. These 2 centuries, as the testimony goeth, brought down to us through our predecessors." It was true as to recent times at least, for there was witness to it, and better witness than a monk. Only about 20 or 30 feet of the chain showed wear in use. The rest of it was unworn and rusty. What had happened when the well gave out that other time? Without doubt some practical person had come along and mended the leak, and then had come up and told the abbot he had discovered by divination that if the sinful bath were destroyed, the well would flow again. The leak had befallen again now, and these children would have prayed and processioned and tolled their bells for heavenly succor till they all dried up and blew away. and no innocent of them all would ever have thought to drop a fish line into the well or go down in it and find out what was really the matter. Old habit of mind is one of the toughest things to get away from in the world. It transmits itself like physical form and feature, and for a man, in those days, to have had an idea that his ancestors hadn't had would have brought him under suspicion of being illegitimate. I said to the monk, "It is a difficult miracle to restore water in a dry well, but we will try, if my brother Merlin fails. Brother Merlin is a very passable artist, but only in the parlor magic line, and he may not succeed, in fact, is not likely to succeed, but that should be nothing to his discredit. The man that can do this kind of miracle knows enough to keep hotel." Hotel? I mind not to have heard of hotel. It's what you call hostel. The man that can do this miracle can keep hostel. I can do this miracle, I shall do this miracle, yet I do not try to conceal from you that it is a miracle to tax the occult powers to the last strain. None knoweth that truth better than the brotherhood. Indeed, for it is of record that aforetime it was parlous difficult, and took a year. Natheless, God send you good success, and to that end will we pray. As a matter of business, it was a good idea to get the notion around that the thing was difficult. Many a small thing has been made large by the right kind of advertising. That monk was filled up with the difficulty of this enterprise, he would fill up the others. In 2 days the solicitude would be booming. On my way home at noon, I met Sandy. She had been sampling the hermits. I said, "I would like to do that myself. This is Wednesday. Is there a matinee?" "A which, please you, sir?" "Matinee. Do they keep open afternoons?" "Ooh. The hermits, of course." "Keep open." "Died. Yes, keep open." "Isn't that plain enough? Do they knock off at noon?" "Knock off." "Knock off?" "Yes, knock off. What is the matter with knock off?" "I never saw such a dunderhead. Can't you understand anything at all? In plain terms, do they shut up shop, draw the game, bank the fires?" "Shut up shop, draw." "There, never mind, let it go, you make me tired. You can't seem to understand the simplest thing." I might please thee, sir, and it is to me dole and sorrow that I fail, albeit sith I am but a simple damsel, and taught of none, being from the cradle unbaptized in those deep waters of learning that do anoint with a sovereignty him that partaketh that most noble sacrament, investing him with reverent state to the mental eye of the humble mortal, who, by bar and lack of that great consecration, seeth in his own unlearned estate, but a symbol of that other sort of lack and loss which men do publish to the pitying eye with sackcloth trappings, whereon the ashes of grief do lie bepowdered and bestrewn. And so, when such shall in the darkness of his mind encounter these golden phrases of high mystery, these shut up shops, and draw the game, and bank the fires, it is but by the grace of God that he burst not for envy of the mind that can beget, and tongue that can deliver so great and mellow-sounding miracles of speech, and if there do ensue confusion in that humbler mind, and failure to divine the meanings of these wonders, then if so be this miscomprehension is not vain but sooth and true, wit ye well it is the very substance of worshipful dear homage, and may not lightly be misprized. Nor had been, and ye had noted this complexion of mood and mind, and understood that I could not, and that I could not, I might not, nor yet, nor might, nor could, nor might not, nor could not, might be by advantage turned to the desired would. And so I pray you mercy of my fault, and that ye will of your kindness and your charity forgive it, good my master and most dear lord. I couldn't make it all out, that is, the details, but I got the general idea, and enough of it too to be ashamed. It was not fair to spring those 19th century technicalities upon the untutored infant of the 6th, and then rail at her because she couldn't get their drift, and when she was making the honest best drive at it she could, too, and no fault of hers that she couldn't fetch the home plate. And so I apologized. Then we meandered pleasantly away toward the hermit holes in sociable converse together, and better friends than ever. I was gradually coming to have a mysterious and shuddery reverence for this girl nowadays whenever she pulled out from the station and got her train fairly started on one of those horizonless transcontinental sentences of hers. It was borne in upon me that I was standing in the awful presence of the mother of the German language. I was so impressed with this, that sometimes when she began to empty one of these sentences on me, I unconsciously took the very attitude of reverence, and stood uncovered, and if words had been water, I had been drowned. Sure, she had exactly the German way, whatever was in her mind to be delivered, whether a mere remark, or a sermon, or a cyclopedia, or the history of a war, she would get it into a single sentence or die. Whenever the literary German dives into a sentence, That is the last you are going to see of him till he emerges on the other side of his Atlantic with his verb in his mouth. We drifted from hermit to hermit all the afternoon. It was a most strange menagerie. The chief emulation among them seemed to be to see which could manage to be the uncleanest and most prosperous with vermin. Their manner and attitudes were the last expression of complacent self-righteousness. It was one anchorit's pride to lie naked in the mud and let the insects bite him and blister him unmolested. It was another's to lean against a rock all day long, conspicuous to the admiration of the throng of pilgrims, and pray. It was another's to go naked and crawl around on all fours. It was another's to drag about with him, year in and year out, 80 pounds of iron. It was another's to never lie down when he slept, but to stand among the thorn bushes and snore when there were pilgrims around to look. A woman, who had the white hair of age and no other apparel, was black from crown to heel with 47 years of holy abstinence from water. Groups of gazing pilgrims stood around all and every of these strange objects, lost in reverent wonder and envious of the fleckless sanctity which these pious austerities had won for them from an exacting heaven. By and by we went to see one of the supremely great ones. He was a mighty celebrity. His fame had penetrated all Christendom. The noble and the renowned journeyed from the remotest lands on the globe to pay him reverence. His stand was in the center of the widest part of the valley, and it took all that space to hold his crowds. His stand was a pillar 60 feet high, with a broad platform on the top of it. He was now doing what he had been doing every day for 20 years up there, bowing his body ceaselessly and rapidly almost to his feet. It was his way of praying. I timed him with a stopwatch, and he made 1,244 revolutions in 24 minutes and 46 seconds. It seemed a pity to have all this power going to waste. It was one of the most useful motions in mechanics, the pedal movement, so I made a note in my memorandum book, purposing someday to apply a system of elastic cords to him and run a sewing machine with it. I afterward carried out that scheme, and got 5 years' good service out of him, in which time he turned out upward of 18,000 first-rate tow linen shirts, which was 10 a day. I worked him Sundays and all he was going. Sundays the same as weekdays, and it was no use to waste the power. These shirts cost me nothing but just the mere trifle for the materials. I furnished those myself. It would not have been right to make him do that, and they sold like smoke to pilgrims at $1.50 apiece, which was the price of 50 cows or a blooded racehorse in Arthurdom. They were regarded as a perfect protection against sin, and advertised as such by my knights everywhere, with the paint pot and stencil plate, insomuch that there was not a cliff or a boulder or a dead wall in England but you could read on it at a mile distance. By the only genuine Saint Stylite patronized by the nobility. Patent applied for. There was more money in the business than one knew what to do with. As it extended, I brought out a line of goods suitable for kings, and a knobby thing for duchesses and that sort, with ruffles down the forehatch, and the running gear clued up with a feather stitch to leeward, and then hauled aft with a back stay, and triced up with a half-turn in the standing rigging forward of the weather gaskets. Yes, it was a daisy. But about that time I noticed that the motive power had taken to standing on one leg, and I found that there was something the matter with the other one, so I stocked the business and unloaded, taking Sir Bors de Ganis into camp financially along with certain of his friends. For the work stopped within a year, and the good saint got him to his rest. But he had earned it. I can say that for him. When I saw him that first time, however, his personal condition will not quite bear description here. You can read it in the Lives of the Saints. All the details concerning the hermits in this chapter are from Lecky but greatly modified. This book not being a history but only a tale, the majority of the historian's frank details were too strong for reproduction in it-editor. Chapter 23. Restoration of the Fountain. Saturday noon I went to the well and looked on a while. Merlin was still burning smoke powders, and pawing the air, and muttering gibberish as hard as ever, but looking pretty downhearted, for of course he had not started even a perspiration in that well yet. Finally I said, "How does the thing promise by this time, partner?" "Behold, I am even now busied with trial of the powerfulest enchantment known to the princes of the occult arts in the lands of the East, and it fail me, naught can avail. Peace, until I finish." He raised a smoke this time that darkened all the region, and must have made matters uncomfortable for the hermits, for the wind was their way, and it rolled down over their dens in a dense and billowy fog. He poured out volumes of speech to match, and contorted his body, and sawed the air with his hands in a most extraordinary way. At the end of 20 minutes he dropped down panting, and about exhausted. Now arrived the abbot and several hundred monks and nuns, and behind them a multitude of pilgrims and a couple of acres of foundlings, all drawn by the prodigious smoke, and all in a grand state of excitement. The abbot inquired anxiously for results. Merlin said, "If any labor of mortal might break the spell that binds these waters, this which I have but just essayed had done it. It has failed, whereby I do now know that which I had feared is a truth established. The sign of this failure is, that the most potent spirit known to the magicians of the East, and whose name none may utter and live, has laid his spell upon this well. The mortal does not breathe, nor ever will, who can penetrate the secret of that spell, and without that secret none can break it. The water will flow no more forever, good father. I have done what man could. Suffer me to go." Of course this threw the abbot into a good deal of a consternation. He turned to me with the signs of it in his face, and said, "Ye have heard him. Is it true?" "Part of it is." "Not all, then, not all." "What part is true?" That spirit with the Russian name has put his spell upon the well. God's wounds, then, are we ruined? Possibly. May. But not certainly. Not certainly. That is it. Wherefore ye also mean that when he saith none can break the spell. Yes, when he says that, he says what isn't necessarily true. There are conditions under which an effort to break it may have some chance, that is, some small, some trifling chance of success. But the conditions. Oh, they are nothing difficult. Only these: I want the well and the surroundings for the space of half a mile, entirely to myself from sunset to day, until I remove the ban, and nobody allowed to cross the ground but by my authority. Are these all? Yes. And you have no fear to try? Oh, none. One may fail, of course, and one may also succeed. One can try, and I am ready to chance it. I have my conditions. These and all others ye may name. I will issue commandment to that effect. Wait, said Merlin, with an evil smile. Ye wit that he that would break this spell must know that spirit's name. Yes, I know his name. And wit you also that to know it skills not of itself, but ye must likewise pronounce it. Ha ha, knew ye that? Yes, I knew that too. You had that knowledge. Art a fool? Are ye minded to utter that name and die? Utter it? Why, certainly. I would utter it if it was Welsh. Ye are even a dead man, then, and I go to tell Arthur. That's all right. Take your gripsack and get along. The thing for you to do is to go home and work the weather. John W. Merlin. It was a home shot, and it made him wince, for he was the worst weather failure in the kingdom. Whenever he ordered up the danger signals along the coast, there was a week's dead calm. Sure, and every time he prophesied fair weather, it rained brickbats. But I kept him in the Weather Bureau right along, to undermine his reputation. However, that shot raised his bile, and instead of starting home to report my death, he said he would remain and enjoy it. My two experts arrived in the evening, and pretty well fagged, for they had traveled double tides. They had packed mules along, and had brought everything I needed: tools, pump, lead pipe, Greek fire, sheaves of big rockets, Roman candles, colored fire sprays, electric apparatus, and a lot of sundries, everything necessary for the stateliest kind of a miracle. They got their supper and a nap, and about midnight we sallied out through a solitude so wholly vacant and complete that it quite overpassed the required conditions. We took possession of the well and its surroundings. My boys were experts in all sorts of things, from the stoning up of a well to the constructing of a mathematical instrument. An hour before sunrise we had that leak mended in ship-shape fashion, and the water began to rise. Then we stowed our fireworks in the chapel, locked up the place, and went home to bed. Before the noon mass was over, we were at the well again, for there was a deal to do yet. And I was determined to spring the miracle before midnight, for business reasons, for whereas a miracle worked for the church on a weekday is worth a good deal, it is worth 6 times as much if you get it in on a Sunday. In 9 hours the water had risen to its customary level, that is to say, it was within 23 feet of the top. We put in a little iron pump, one of the first turned out by my works near the Capitol. We bored into a stone reservoir, which stood against the outer wall of the well chamber, and inserted a section of lead pipe that was long enough to reach to the door of the chapel and project beyond the threshold, where the gushing water would be visible to the 250 acres of people I was intending should be present on the flat plain in front of this little holy hillock, at the proper time. We knocked the head out of an empty hogshed and hoisted this hogshed to the flat roof of the chapel, where we clamped it down fast, poured in gunpowder till it lay loosely an inch deep on the bottom. Then we stood up rockets in the hogshed as thick as they could loosely stand. All the different breeds of rockets there are, and they made a portly and imposing sheaf. I can tell you. We grounded the wire of a pocket electrical battery in that powder. We placed a whole magazine of Greek fire on each corner of the roof, blue on one corner, green on another, red on another, and purple on the last, and grounded a wire in each. About 200 yards off, in the flat, we built a pen of scantlings, about 4 feet high, and laid planks on it, and so made a platform. We covered it with swell tapestries borrowed for the occasion, and topped it off with the abbot's own throne. When you are going to do a miracle for an ignorant race, you want to get in every detail that will count. You want to make all the properties impressive to the public eye. You want to make matters comfortable for your head guest. Then you can turn yourself loose and play your effects for all they are worth. I know the value of these things, for I know human nature. You can't throw too much style into a miracle. It costs trouble and work and sometimes money, but it pays in the end. Well, we brought the wires to the ground at the chapel, and then brought them under the ground to the platform and hid the batteries there. We put a rope fence 100 feet square around the platform to keep off the common multitude, and that finished the work. My idea was, doors open at 10:30, performance to begin at 11:25 sharp. I wished I could charge admission, but of course that wouldn't answer. I instructed my boys to be in the chapel as early as 10, before anybody was around, and be ready to man the pumps at the proper time and make the fur fly. Then we went home to supper. The news of the disaster to the well had traveled far by this time, and now for 2 or 3 days a steady avalanche of people had been pouring into the valley. The lower end of the valley was become one huge camp. We should have a good house, no question about that. Criers went the rounds early in the evening and announced the coming attempt, which put every pulse up to fever heat. They gave notice that the abbot and his official suite would move in state and occupy the platform at 10:30, up to which time all the region which was under my ban must be clear. The bells would then cease from tolling, and this sign should be permission to the multitudes to close in and take their places. I was at the platform and all ready to do the honors when the abbot's solemn procession hove in sight, which it did not do till it was nearly to the rope fence, because it was a starless black night and no torches permitted. With it came Merlin, and took a front seat on the platform. He was as good as his word for once. One could not see the multitudes banked together beyond the ban, but they were there, just the same. The moment the bells stopped, those banked masses broke and poured over the line like a vast black wave, and for as much as a half hour it continued to flow, and then it solidified itself, and you could have walked upon a pavement of human heads to miles. We had a solemn stage wait. Now, for about 20 minutes, a thing I had counted on for effect. It is always good to let your audience have a chance to work up its expectancy. At length, out of the silence, a noble Latin chant, men's voices broke and swelled up and rolled away into the night, a majestic tide of melody. I had put that up too, and it was one of the best effects I ever invented. When it was finished, I stood up on the platform and extended my hands abroad, for 2 minutes, with my face uplifted that always produces a dead hush, and then slowly pronounced this ghastly word with a kind of awfulness which caused hundreds to tremble, and many women to faint. Konstantinopolitanischer Dudelsackspfeifenmachersche Gesellschaft. Just as I was moaning out the closing hunks of that word, I touched off one of my electric connections, and all that murky world of people stood revealed in a hideous blue glare. It was immense, that effect. Lots of people shrieked, women curled up and quit in every direction, foundlings collapsed by platoons. The abbot and the monks crossed themselves nimbly, and their lips fluttered with agitated prayers. Merlin held his grip, but he was astonished clear down to his corns. He had never seen anything to begin with that before. Now was the time to pile in the effects. I lifted my hands and groaned out this word as it were in agony. Nihilisten Dynamit Theater Chaoschen Sprengungsatten Tates Versuchungen, and turned on the red fire. You should have heard that Atlantic of people moan and howl when that crimson hell joined the blue. After 60 seconds I shouted, Transvaal Truppen Transport Trimpelthier Tribertraumstrain and Trigodi, and lit up the green fire. After waiting only 40 seconds this time, I spread my arms abroad and thundered out the devastating syllables of this word of words. Mek kam Uselman and Massen Minchen Mordermor and Mutter Marmi Min Tenmacher, and whirled on the purple glare. There they were, all going at once, red, blue, green, purple. 4 furious volcanoes pouring vast clouds of radiant smoke aloft, and spreading a blinding rainbow noonday to the furthest confines of that valley. In the distance one could see that fellow on the pillar standing rigid against the background of sky. His seesaw stopped for the first time in 20 years. I knew the boys were at the pump now and ready, so I said to the abbot, "The time has come, Father. I am about to pronounce the dread name and command the spell to dissolve. You want to brace up and take hold of something." Then I shouted to the people, "Behold, in another minute the spell will be broken, or no mortal can break it. If it break, all will know it, for you will see the sacred water gush from the chapel door." I stood a few moments to let the hearers have a chance to spread my announcement to those who couldn't hear, and so convey it to the furthest ranks. Then I made a grand exhibition of extra posturing and gesturing, and shouted, "Lo, I command the fell spirit that possesses the holy fountain to now disgorge into the skies all the infernal fires that still remain in him, and straightway dissolve his spell and flee hence to the pit, there to lie bound 1,000 years. By his own dread name I command it, BGJUJJILLIGKKKKK." Then I touched off the hogshead of rockets, and a vast fountain of dazzling lances of fire vomited itself toward the zenith with a hissing rush, and burst in mid-sky into a storm of flashing jewels. One mighty groan of terror started up from the massed people, then suddenly broke into a wild hosanna of joy, for there, fair and plain in the uncanny glare, they saw the freed water leaping forth. The old abbot could not speak a word, for tears and the chokings in his throat. Without utterance of any sort, he folded me in his arms and mashed me. It was more eloquent than speech, and harder to get over, too, in a country where there were really no doctors that were worth a damaged nickel. You should have seen those acres of people throw themselves down in that water and kiss it, and pet it, and fondle it, and talk to it as if it were alive, and welcome it back with the dear names they gave their darlings, just as if it had been a friend who was long gone away and lost, and was come home again. Yes, it was pretty to see, and made me think more of them than I had done before. I sent Merlin home on a shutter. He had caved in and gone down like a landslide when I pronounced that fearful name, and had never come to since. He never had heard that name before, neither had I, but to him it was the right one. Any jumble would have been the right one. He admitted, afterward, that that spirit's own mother could not have pronounced that name better than I did. He never could understand how I survived it, and I didn't tell him. It is only young magicians that give away a secret like that. Merlin spent 3 months working enchantments to try to find out the deep trick of how to pronounce that name and outlive it. But he didn't arrive. When I started to the chapel, the populace uncovered and fell back reverently to make a wide way for me, as if I had been some kind of a superior being, and I was. I was aware of that. I took along a night shift of monks and taught them the mystery of the pump and set them to work, for it was plain that a good part of the people out there were going to sit up with the water all night. Consequently, it was but right that they should have all they wanted of it. To those monks, that pump was a good deal of a miracle itself, and they were full of wonder over it, and of admiration, too, of the exceeding effectiveness of its performance. It was a great night, an immense night. There was reputation in it. I could hardly get to sleep for glorying over it. Chapter 24. A Rival Magician. My influence in the Valley of Holiness was something prodigious now. It seemed worthwhile to try to turn it to some valuable account. The thought came to me the next morning, and was suggested by my seeing one of my knights who was in the soap line come riding in. According to history, the monks of this place 2 centuries before had been worldly minded enough to want to watch. It might be that there was a leaven of this unrighteousness still remaining. So I sounded a brother. "Wouldn't you like a bath?" He shuddered at the thought of the peril of it to the well, but he said with feeling, "One needs not to ask that of a poor body who has not known that blessed refreshment sith that he was a boy. Would God I might wash me. But it may not be, fair sir. Tempt me not, it is forbidden." And then he sighed in such a sorrowful way that I was resolved he should have at least 1 layer of his real estate removed, if it sized up my whole influence and bankrupted the pile. So I went to the abbot and asked for a permit for this brother. He blenched at the idea. I don't mean that you could see him blench, for of course you couldn't see it without you scraped him, and I didn't care enough about it to scrape him, but I knew the blench was there, just the same, and within a book cover's thickness of the surface, too blenched, and trembled. He said, "Ah, son, ask aught else thou wilt, and it is thine, and freely granted out of a grateful heart, but this, oh this, would you drive away the blessed water again?" "No, father, I will not drive it away. I have mysterious knowledge which teaches me that there was an error that other time, when it was thought the institution of the bath banished the fountain. A large interest began to show up in the old man's face. My knowledge informs me that the bath was innocent of that misfortune, which was caused by quite another sort of sin. These are brave words, but right welcome, if they be true. They are true indeed. Let me build the bath again, father. Let me build it again, and the fountain shall flow forever. You promise this? You promise it. Say the word, say you promise it. I do promise it. Then will I have the first bath myself. Go get ye to your work. Tarry not, but go. I and my boys were at work, straight off. The ruins of the old bath were there yet in the basement of the monastery, not a stone missing. They had been left just so, all these lifetimes, and avoided with a pious fear, as things accursed. In 2 days we had it all done, and the water in a spacious pool of clear pure water that a body could swim in. It was running water, too. It came in, and went out, through the ancient pipes. The old abbot kept his word, and was the first to try it. He went down black and shaky, leaving the whole black community above troubled and worried and full of bodings, but he came back white and joyful, and the game was made. Another triumph scored. It was a good campaign that we made in that Valley of Holiness, and I was very well satisfied, and ready to move on now, but I struck a disappointment. I caught a heavy cold, and it started up an old lurking rheumatism of mine. Of course, the rheumatism hunted up my weakest place and located itself there. This was the place where the abbot put his arms about me and mashed me. What time he was moved to testify his gratitude to me with an embrace. When at last I got out, I was a shadow. But everybody was full of attentions and kindnesses, and these brought cheer back into my life, and were the right medicine to help a convalescent swiftly up toward health and strength again, so I gained fast. Sandy was worn out with nursing, so I made up my mind to turn out and go a cruise alone, leaving her at the nunnery to rest up. My idea was to disguise myself as a freeman of peasant degree and wander through the country a week or two on foot. This would give me a chance to eat and lodge with the lowliest and poorest class of free citizens on equal terms. There was no other way to inform myself perfectly of their everyday life and the operation of the laws upon it. If I went among them as a gentleman, there would be restraints and conventionalities which would shut me out from their private joys and troubles, and I should get no further than the outside shell. One morning I was out on a long walk to get up muscle for my trip, and had climbed the ridge which bordered the northern extremity of the valley, when I came upon an artificial opening in the face of a low precipice, and recognized it by its location as a hermitage, which had often been pointed out to me from a distance as the den of a hermit of high renown for dirt and austerity. I knew he had lately been offered a situation in the Great Sahara, where lions and sandflies made the hermit life peculiarly attractive and difficult, and had gone to Africa to take possession, so I thought I would look in and see how the atmosphere of this den agreed with its reputation. My surprise was great. The place was newly swept and scoured. Then there was another surprise. Back in the gloom of the cavern I heard the clink of a little bell, and then this exclamation. Hello, Central. Is this you, Camelot? Behold, thou mayst glad thy heart, and thou hast faith to believe the wonderful when that it cometh in unexpected guise, and maketh itself manifest in impossible places. Here standeth in the flesh his mightiness the boss. And with thine own ears shall ye hear him speak. Now what a radical reversal of things this was, what a jumbling together of extravagant incongruities, what a fantastic conjunction of opposites and irreconcilables. The home of the bogus miracle become the home of a real one. The den of a medieval hermit turned into a telephone office. The telephone clerk stepped into the light, and I recognized one of my young fellows. I said, "How long has this office been established here, Ulfius?" "But since midnight, fair Sir Boss, and it please you. We saw many lights in the valley, and so judged it well to make a station, for that where so many lights be needs must they indicate a town of goodly size." "Quite right. It isn't a town in the customary sense, but it's a good stand anyway. Do you know where you are?" "Of that I have had no time to make inquiry, for when as my comradeship moved hence upon their labors, leaving me in charge, I got me to needed rest, purposing to inquire when I waked, and report the place's name to Camelot for record. Well, this is the Valley of Holiness. He didn't start at the name, as I had supposed he would. He merely said, 'I will so report it.' Why, the surrounding regions are filled with the noise of late wonders that have happened here. You didn't hear of them. Ah, ye will remember we move by night, and avoid speech with all. We learn not, but that we get by the telephone from Camelot. Why, they know all about this thing. Haven't they told you anything about the great miracle of the restoration of a holy fountain?" "Oh, that! Indeed, yes. But the name of this valley doth woundily differ from the name of that one, indeed to differ wider were not Pios." "What was that name, then?" "The Valley of Hellishness." "That explains it. Confound a telephone, anyway. It is the very demon for conveying similarities of sound that are miracles of divergence from similarity of sense. But no matter, you know the name of the place now. Call up Camelot. He did it, and had Clarence sent for. It was good to hear my boy's voice again. It was like being home. After some affectionate interchanges, and some account of my late illness, I said, "What is new? What is new? The king and queen and many of the court do start even in this hour, to go to your valley to pay pious homage to the waters ye have restored, and cleanse themselves of sin. And see the place where the infernal spirit spouted true hell flames to the clouds, and ye listen sharply, ye may hear me wink, and hear me likewise smile a smile. Sith 'twas I that made selection of those flames from out our stock, and sent them by your order. Does the king know the way to this place?" "The king? No, nor to any other in his realms, mayhap, but the lads that holp you with your miracle will be his guide and lead the way, and appoint the places for rests at noons and sleeps at night. This will bring them here when? Mid-afternoon, or later the third day. Anything else in the way of news?" "The king hath begun the raising of the standing army ye suggested to him. One regiment is complete and officered. The mischief. I wanted a main hand in that myself. There is only one body of men in the kingdom that are fitted to officer a regular army. Yes, and now ye will marvel to know there's not so much as one West Pointer in that regiment." "What are you talking about? Are you in earnest?" "It is truly as I have said." "Why, this makes me uneasy. Who were chosen, and what was the method?" "Competitive examination." "Indeed, I know not of the method. I but know this, these officers be all of noble family, and are born, what is it you call it, chuckleheads." "There's something wrong, Clarence." "Comfort yourself. Then for 2 candidates for a lieutenancy do travel hence with the king, young nobles both, and if you but wait where you are, you will hear them questioned." "That is news to the purpose. I will get one West Pointer in, anyway. Mount a man and send him to that school with a message, let him kill horses, if necessary, but he must be there before sunset tonight, and say, 'There is no need. I have laid a ground wire to the school. Prithee let me connect you with it.'" It sounded good. In this atmosphere of telephones and lightning communication with distant regions, I was breathing the breath of life again after long suffocation. I realized then what a creepy, dull, inanimate horror this land had been to me all these years, and how I had been in such a stifled condition of mind as to have grown used to it almost beyond the power to notice it. I gave my order to the superintendent of the academy personally. I also asked him to bring me some paper and a fountain pen and a box or so of safety matches. I was getting tired of doing without these conveniences. I could have them now, as I wasn't going to wear armor anymore at present, and therefore could get at my pockets. When I got back to the monastery, I found a thing of interest going on. The abbot and his monks were assembled in the great hall, observing with childish wonder and faith the performances of a new magician, a fresh arrival. His dress was the extreme of the fantastic, as showy and foolish as the sort of thing an Indian medicine man wears. He was mowing and mumbling and gesticulating and drawing mystical figures in the air and on the floor, the regular thing, you know. He was a celebrity from Asia, so he said, and that was enough. That sort of evidence was as good as gold and passed current everywhere. How easy and cheap it was to be a great magician on this fellow's terms. His specialty was to tell you what any individual on the face of the globe was doing at the moment, and what he had done at any time in the past, and what he would do at any time in the future. He asked if any would like to know what the Emperor of the East was doing now. The sparkling eyes and the delighted rubbing of hands made eloquent answer. This reverend crowd would like to know what that monarch was at, just as this moment. The fraud went through some more mummery, and then made grave announcement. "The high and mighty Emperor of the East doth at this moment put money in the palm of a holy begging friar, 1, 2, 3 pieces, and they be all of silver." A buzz of admiring exclamations broke out, all around. It is marvelous, wonderful, what study, what labor, to have acquired a so amazing power as this. Would they like to know what the Supreme Lord of India was doing? Yes, he told them what the Supreme Lord of India was doing. Then he told them what the Sultan of Egypt was, and also what the King of the remote seas was about. And so on, and so on, and with each new marvel the astonishment at his accuracy rose higher and higher. They thought he must surely strike an uncertain place some time, but no, he never had to hesitate. He always knew, and always with unerring precision. I saw that if this thing went on, I should lose my supremacy. This fellow would capture my following. I should be left out in the cold. I must put a cog in his wheel, and do it right away too. I said. If I might ask, I should very greatly like to know what a certain person is doing. Speak, and freely. I will tell you. It will be difficult, perhaps impossible. My art knoweth not that word. The more difficult it is, the more certainly will I reveal it to you. You see, I was working up the interest. It was getting pretty high, too. You could see that by the craning necks all around, and the half-suspended breathing. So now I climaxed it. If you make no mistake, if you tell me truly what I want to know, I will give you 200 silver pennies. The fortune is mine. I will tell you what you would know. Then tell me what I am doing with my right hand. There was a general gasp of surprise. It had not occurred to anybody in the crowd that simple trick of inquiring about somebody who wasn't 10,000 miles away. The magician was hit hard. It was an emergency that had never happened in his experience before, and it corked him. He didn't know how to meet it. He looked stunned, confused. He couldn't say a word. I said, "What are you waiting for? Is it possible you can answer up, right off, and tell what anybody on the other side of the earth is doing, and yet can't tell what a person is doing who isn't 3 yards from you? Persons behind me know what I am doing with my right hand. They will endorse you if you tell correctly." He was still dumb. "Very well, I'll tell you why you don't speak up and tell it is because you don't know. You a magician. Good friends, this tramp is a mere fraud and liar." This distressed the monks and terrified them. They were not used to hearing these awful beings called names, and they did not know what might be the consequence. There was a dead silence now. Superstitious bodings were in every mind. The magician began to pull his wits together, and when he presently smiled an easy, nonchalant smile, it spread a mighty relief around, for it indicated that his mood was not destructive. He said, "It hath struck me speechless, the frivolity of this person's speech. Let all know, if perchance there be any who know it not, that enchanters of my degree deign not to concern themselves with the doings of any but kings, princes, emperors, and that be born in the purple, and them only. Had ye asked me what Arthur the great king is doing, it were another matter, and I had told ye, but the doings of a subject interest me not." "Oh, I misunderstood you. I thought you said anybody, and so I supposed anybody included well, anybody, that is, everybody. It doth anybody that is of lofty birth, and the better if he be royal. That, it meseemeth, might well be," said the abbot, who saw his opportunity to smooth things and avert disaster, for it were not likely that so wonderful a gift as this would be conferred for the revelation of the concerns of lesser beings than such as be born near to the summits of greatness. "Our Arthur the king. Would you know of him?" broke in the enchanter. "Most gladly, yeah, and gratefully." Everybody was full of awe and interest again right away. The incorrigible idiots. They watched the incantations absorbingly, and looked at me with a "There, now, what can you say to that air?" when the announcement came. "The king is weary with the chase, and lieth in his palace these 2 hours sleeping a dreamless sleep." "God's benison upon him," said the abbot, and crossed himself. "May that sleep be to the refreshment of his body and his soul." "And so it might be, if he were sleeping," I said, "but the king is not sleeping, the king rides." Here was trouble again, a conflict of authority. Nobody knew which of us to believe. I still had some reputation left. The magician's scorn was stirred, and he said, "Lo, I have seen many wonderful soothsayers and prophets and magicians in my life days, but none before that could sit idle and see to the heart of things with never an incantation to help. You have lived in the woods and lost much by it. I use incantations myself, as this good brotherhood are aware, but only on occasions of moment. When it comes to sarcasming, I reckon I know how to keep my end up. That jab made this fellow squirm." The abbot inquired after the queen and the court, and got this information. "They be all on sleep, being overcome by fatigue, like as to the king," I said. "Now, that is merely another lie. Half of them are about their amusements. The queen and the other half are not sleeping, they ride. Now perhaps you can spread yourself a little, and tell us where the king and queen and all that are this moment riding with them are going." "They sleep now, as I said, but on the morrow they will ride, for they go a journey toward the sea." "And where will they be the day after tomorrow at vespers?" "Far to the north of Camelot, and half their journey will be done." "That is another lie, by the space of 150 miles. Their journey will not be merely half done, it will be all done, and they will be here, in this valley." That was a noble shot. It set the abbot and the monks in a whirl of excitement, and it rocked the enchanter to his base. I followed the thing right up. "If the king does not arrive, I will have myself ridden on a rail. If he does, I will ride you on a rail instead." Next day I went up to the telephone office and found that the king had passed through 2 towns that were on the line. I spotted his progress on the succeeding day in the same way. I kept these matters to myself. The 3rd day's reports showed that if he kept up his gait, he would arrive by 4 in the afternoon. There was still no sign anywhere of interest in his coming there, seemed to be no preparations making to receive him, and stayed a strange thing, truly. Only one thing could explain this: that other magician had been cutting under me. Sure. This was true. I asked a friend of mine, a monk, about it, and he said, yes, the magician had tried some further enchantments and found out that the court had concluded to make no journey at all, but stay at home. Think of that. Observe how much a reputation was worth in such a country. These people had seen me do the very showiest bit of magic in history, and the only one within their memory that had a positive value, and yet here they were, ready to take up with an adventurer who could offer no evidence of his powers but his mere unproven word. However, it was not good politics to let the king come without any fuss and feathers at all, so I went down and drummed up a procession of pilgrims and smoked out a batch of hermits and started them out at 2 o'clock to meet him. And that was the sort of state he arrived in. The abbot was helpless with rage and humiliation when I brought him out on a balcony and showed him the head of the state marching in, and never a monk on hand to offer him welcome, and no stir of life or clang of joy bell to glad his spirit. He took one look and then flew to rouse out his forces. The next minute the bells were dinning furiously, and the various buildings were vomiting monks and nuns, who went swarming in a rush toward the coming procession, and with them went that magician, and he was on a rail, too, by the abbot's order, and his reputation was in the mud. And mine was in the sky again. Yes, a man can keep his trademark current in such a country, but he can't sit around and do it. He has got to be on deck and attending to business right along. Chapter 25. Competitive examination. When the king traveled for change of air, or made a progress, or visited a distant noble whom he wished to bankrupt with the cost of his keep, part of the administration moved with him. It was a fashion of the time. The commission charged with the examination of candidates for posts in the army came with the king to the valley, whereas they could have transacted their business just as well at home. And although this expedition was strictly a holiday excursion for the king, he kept some of his business functions going just the same. He touched for the evil. As usual, he held court in the gate at sunrise and tried cases, for he was himself Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He shone very well in this latter office. He was a wise and humane judge, and he clearly did his honest best and fairest, according to his lights. That is a large reservation. His lights, I mean his rearing, often colored his decisions. Whenever there was a dispute between a noble or gentleman and a person of lower degree, the king's leanings and sympathies were for the former class always, whether he suspected it or not. It was impossible that this should be otherwise. The blunting effects of slavery upon the slaveholders' moral perceptions are known and conceded, the world over, and a privileged class, an aristocracy, is but a band of slaveholders under another name. This has a harsh sound, and yet should not be offensive to any, even to the noble himself, unless the fact itself be an offense, for the statement simply formulates a fact. The repulsive feature of slavery is the thing, not its name. One needs but to hear an aristocrat speak of the classes that are below him to recognize, and in but indifferently modified measure, the very air and tone of the actual slaveholder, and behind these are the slaveholder's spirit, the slaveholder's blunted feeling. They are the result of the same cause, in both cases the possessor's old and inbred custom of regarding himself as a superior being. The king's judgments wrought frequent injustices, but it was merely the fault of his training, his natural and unalterable sympathies. He was as unfitted for a judgeship as would be the average mother for the position of milk distributor to starving children in famine time. Her own children would fare a shade better than the rest. One very curious case came before the king. A young girl, an orphan, who had a considerable estate, married a fine young fellow who had nothing. The girl's property was within a seigniory held by the church. The bishop of the diocese, an arrogant scion of the great nobility, claimed the girl's estate on the ground that she had married privately, and thus had cheated the church out of one of its rights as lord of the seigniory, the one heretofore referred to as le droit du seigneur. The penalty of refusal or avoidance was confiscation. The girl's defense was that the lordship of the seigniory was vested in the bishop, and the particular right here involved was not transferable, but must be exercised by the lord himself or stand vacated, and that an older law of the church itself strictly barred the bishop from exercising it. It was a very odd case indeed. It reminded me of something I had read in my youth about the ingenious way in which the aldermen of London raised the money that built the Mansion House. A person who had not taken the sacrament according to the Anglican rite could not stand as a candidate for Sheriff of London. Thus dissenters were ineligible. They could not run if asked. They could not serve if elected. The aldermen, who without any question were Yankees in disguise, hit upon this neat device. They passed a bylaw imposing a fine of L400 upon any one who should refuse to be a candidate for sheriff, and a fine of L600 upon any person who, after being elected sheriff, refused to serve. Then they went to work and elected a lot of dissenters, one after another, and kept it up until they had collected L15,000 in fines, and there stands the stately mansion house to this day. To keep the blushing citizen in mind of a long past and lamented day, when a band of Yankees slipped into London and played games of the sort that has given their race a unique and shady reputation among all truly good and holy peoples that be in the earth. The girl's case seemed strong to me. The bishop's case was just as strong. I did not see how the king was going to get out of this hole. But he got out. I append his decision. Truly I find small difficulty here, the matter being even a child's affair for simpleness. And the young bride had conveyed notice, as in duty bound, to her feudal lord and proper master and protector the bishop. She had suffered no loss, for the said bishop could have got a dispensation making him, for temporary conveniency, eligible to the exercise of his said right, and thus would she have kept all she had. Whereas, failing in her first duty, she hath by that failure failed in all, for whoso, clinging to a rope, severeth it above his hands, must fall. It being no defense to claim that the rest of the rope is sound, neither any deliverance from his peril, as he shall find. Party, the woman's case is rotten at the source. It is the decree of the court that she forfeit to the said Lord Bishop all her goods, even to the last farthing that she doth possess, and be thereto mulcted in the costs. Next. Here was a tragic end to a beautiful honeymoon not yet 3 months old. Poor young creatures, they had lived these 3 months lapped to the lips in worldly comforts. These clothes and trinkets they were wearing were as fine and dainty as the shrewdest stretch of the sumptuary laws allowed to people of their degree, and in these pretty clothes, she crying on his shoulder, and he trying to comfort her with hopeful words set to the music of despair. They went from the judgment seat out into the world homeless, bedless, breadless. Why, the very beggars by the roadsides were not so poor as they. Well, the king was out of the hole, and on terms satisfactory to the church and the rest of the aristocracy, no doubt. Men write many fine and plausible arguments in support of monarchy, but the fact remains that where every man in a state has a vote, brutal laws are impossible. Arthur's people were of course poor material for a republic, because they had been debased so long by monarchy, and yet even they would have been intelligent enough to make short work of that law, which the king had just been administering, if it had been submitted to their full and free vote. There is a phrase which has grown so common in the world's mouth that it has come to seem to have sense and meaning the sense, and meaning the sense and meaning implied when it is used. That is the phrase which refers to this or that, or the other nation as possibly being capable of self-government. And the implied sense of it is that there has been a nation somewhere, some time or other, which wasn't capable of it, wasn't as able to govern itself as some self-appointed specialists were, or would be to govern it. The masterminds of all nations, in all ages, have sprung in affluent multitude from the mass of the nation, and from the mass of the nation, only not from its privileged classes, and so, no matter what the nation's intellectual grade was, whether high or low, the bulk of its ability was in the long ranks of its nameless and its poor, and so it never saw the day that it had not the material in abundance whereby to govern itself, which is to assert an always self-proven fact that even the best governed and most free and most enlightened monarchy is still behind the best condition attainable by its people, and that the same is true of kindred governments of lower grades, all the way down to the lowest. King Arthur had hurried up the army business altogether beyond my calculations. I had not supposed he would move in the matter while I was away, and so I had not mapped out a scheme for determining the merits of officers. I had only remarked that it would be wise to submit every candidate to a sharp and searching examination. And privately I meant to put together a list of military qualifications that nobody could answer to but my West Pointers. That ought to have been attended to before I left, for the king was so taken with the idea of a standing army that he couldn't wait but must get about it at once, and get up as good a scheme of examination as he could invent out of his own head. I was impatient to see what this was, and to show, too, how much more admirable was the one which I should display to the examining board. I intimated this gently to the king, and it fired his curiosity. When the board was assembled, I followed him in, and behind us came the candidates. One of these candidates was a bright young West Pointer of mine, and with him were a couple of my West Point professors. When I saw the board, I did not know whether to cry or to laugh. The head of it was the officer known to later centuries as Norway King at Arms. The two other members were chiefs of bureaus in his department, and all three were priests. Of course, all officials who had to know how to read and write were priests. My candidate was called first, out of courtesy to me, and the head of the board opened on him with official solemnity. Name: Mal-Ease, son of E.D. Webster. Webster. Haim. A. My memory faileth to recall the name. Condition: Weaver. D. Weaver. God keep us. The king was staggered. From his summit to his foundations, one clerk fainted, and the others came near it. The chairman pulled himself together and said indignantly, "It is sufficient. Get you hence." But I appealed to the king. The first begged that my candidate might be examined. The king was willing, but the board, who were all well-born folk, implored the king to spare them the indignity of examining the weaver's son. I knew they didn't know enough to examine him anyway, so I joined my prayers to theirs, and the king turned the duty over to my professors. I had had a blackboard prepared, and it was put up now, and the circus began. It was beautiful to hear the lad lay out the science of war, and wallow in details of battle and siege, of supply, transportation, mining and countermining, grand tactics, big strategy and little strategy, signal service, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and all about siege guns, field guns, Gatling guns, rifled guns, smooth bores, musket practice, revolver practice, and not a solitary word of it all could these catfish make head or tail of. You understand, and it was handsome to see him chalk off mathematical nightmares on the blackboard that would stump the angels themselves. And do it like nothing. Too all about eclipses and comets and solstices and constellations and meantime and sidereal time and dinner time and bedtime and every other imaginable thing above the clouds or under them that you could harry or bullyrag an enemy with and make him wish he hadn't come. And when the boy made his military salute and stood aside at last, I was proud enough to hug him. And all those other people were so dazed they looked partly petrified, partly drunk, and wholly caught out and snowed under. I judged that the cake was ours, and by a large majority. Education is a great thing. This was the same youth who had come to West Point so ignorant that when I asked him if a general officer should have a horse shot under him on the field of battle, what ought he to do, answered up naively and said, "Get up and brush himself." One of the young nobles was called up now. I thought I would question him a little myself. I said, "Can your lordship read?" His face flushed indignantly, and he fired this at me. "Takest me for a clerk? I trow I am not of a blood that. Answer the question." "Daki." He crowded his wrath down and made out to answer no. "Can you write?" He wanted to resent this too, but I said, "You will confine yourself to the questions, and make no comments. You are not here to air your blood or your graces, and nothing of the sort will be permitted. Can you write?" "No." "Do you know the multiplication table?" "I wit not what ye refer to." "How much is 9 times 6? "It is a mystery that is hidden from me by reason that the emergency requiring the fathoming of it hath not in my life days occurred, and so, not having no need to know this thing, I abide barren of the knowledge. If a trade a barrel of onions to be, worth 2 pence the bushel, in exchange for a sheep worth 4 pence, and a dog worth a penny, and C kill the dog before delivery, because bitten by the same, who mistook him for D, what sum is still due to a from B, and which party pays for the dog, C or D, and who gets the money? If A, is the penny sufficient, or may he claim consequential damages in the form of additional money to represent the possible profit which might have inured from the dog, and classifiable as earned increment, that is to say, usufruct? Verily, in the all-wise and unknowable providence of God, who moveth in mysterious ways his wonders to perform, have I never heard the fellow to this question for confusion of the mind and congestion of the ducts of thought. Wherefore I beseech you let the dog and the onions, and these people of the strange and godless names work out their several salvations from their piteous and wonderful difficulties, without help of mine, for indeed their trouble is sufficient as it is, whereas an I tried to help I should but damage their cause the more, and yet mayhap not live myself to see the desolation wrought. What do you know of the laws of attraction and gravitation? If there be such, mayhap his grace the king did promulgate them, whilst that I lay sick about the beginning of the year, and thereby failed to hear his proclamation. What do you know of the science of optics? I know of governors of places, and seneschals of castles, and sheriffs of counties, and many like small offices and titles of honor, But him you call the science of optics I have not heard of before, peradventure it is a new dignity. Yes, in this country. Try to conceive of this mollusk gravely applying for an official position, of any kind under the sun. Why, he had all the earmarks of a typewriter copyist, if you leave out the disposition to contribute uninvited emendations of your grammar and punctuation. It was unaccountable that he didn't attempt a little help of that sort out of his majestic supply of incapacity for the job. But that didn't prove that he hadn't material in him for the disposition. It only proved that he wasn't a typewriter copyist yet. After nagging him a little more, I let the professors loose on him, and they turned him inside out, on the line of scientific war, and found him empty, of course. He knew somewhat about the warfare of the time, bushwhacking around for ogres, and bullfights in the tournament ring, and such things, but otherwise he was empty and useless. Then we took the other young noble in hand, and he was the first one's twin for ignorance and incapacity. I delivered them into the hands of the chairman of the board with the comfortable consciousness that their cake was dough. They were examined in the previous order of precedence. Name, so please you. Pertipole, son of Sir Pertipole, Baron of Barley Mash. Grandfather. Dan. Also Sir Pertipole, Baron of Barley Mash. Great-grandfather. Nigh. The same name and title. Great-great-grandfather. We had none, worshipful sir, the line failing before it had reached so far back. It mattereth not. It is a good 4 generations, and fulfilleth the requirements of the rule. Fulfills what rule, I asked. The rule requiring 4 generations of nobility, or else the candidate is not eligible. A man not eligible for a lieutenancy in the army unless he can prove 4 generations of noble descent. Even so, neither lieutenant nor any other officer may be commissioned without that qualification. Oh, come, this is an astonishing thing. What good is such a qualification as that? What good? It is a hearty question, fair sir and boss, since it doth go far to impugn the wisdom of even our Holy Mother Church herself. As how? For that she hath established the self-same rule regarding saints. By her law none may be canonized until he hath lain dead 4 generations. I see it is the same thing. It is wonderful. In the one case a man lies dead alive 4 generations mummified in ignorance and sloth, and that qualifies him to command live people, and take their weal and woe into his impotent hands, and in the other case, a man lies bedded with death and worms 4 generations, and that qualifies him for office in the celestial camp. Does the king's grace approve of this strange law? The king said, Dad, why truly I see naught about it that is strange. All places of honor and of profit do belong, by natural right, to them that be of noble blood. And so these dignities in the army are their property, and would be so without this or any rule. The rule is but to mark a limit. Its purpose is to keep out too recent blood, which would bring into contempt these offices, and men of lofty lineage would turn their backs and scorn to take them. I were to blame and I permitted this calamity. You can permit it and you are minded so to do, for you have the delegated authority, but that the king should do it were a most strange madness and not comprehensible to any. I yield. Proceed, Sir Chief of the Herald's College. The chairman resumed as follows. By what illustrious achievement for the honor of the throne and state did the founder of your great line lift himself to the sacred dignity of the British nobility? He built a brewery. Sire, the board finds this candidate perfect in all the requirements and qualifications for military command, and doth hold his case open for decision after due examination of his competitor. The competitor came forward and proved exactly 4 generations of nobility himself, so there was a tie in military qualifications that far. He stood aside a moment, and Sir Pertipole was questioned further. Of what condition was the wife of the founder of your line? She came of the highest landed gentry, yet she was not noble, she was gracious and pure and charitable, of a blameless life and character, insomuch that in these regards was she peer of the best lady in the land. That will do. Stand down. He called up the competing lordling again, and asked what was the rank and condition of the great-grandmother who conferred British nobility upon your great house. She was a king's leman, and did climb to that splendid eminence by her own unholpen merit from the sewer where she was born. Ah, this indeed is true nobility. This is the right and perfect intermixture. The lieutenancy is yours, fair lord. Hold it not in contempt. It is the humble step which will lead to grandeurs more worthy of the splendor of an origin like to thine. I was down in the bottomless pit of humiliation. I had promised myself an easy and zenith-scouring triumph, and this was the outcome. I was almost ashamed to look my poor disappointed cadet in the face. I told him to go home and be patient. This wasn't the end. I had a private audience with the king and made a proposition. I said it was quite right to officer that regiment with nobilities, and he couldn't have done a wiser thing. It would also be a good idea to add 500 officers to it. In fact, add as many officers as there were nobles and relatives of nobles in the country, even if there should finally be 5 times as many officers as privates in it, and thus make it the crack regiment, the envied regiment, the king's own regiment, and entitled to fight on its own hook and in its own way, and go whither it would and come when it pleased, in time of war, and be utterly swell and independent. This would make that regiment the heart's desire of all the nobility, and they would all be satisfied and happy. Then we would make up the rest of the standing army out of commonplace materials, and officer it with nobodies, as was proper, nobodies selected on a basis of mere efficiency, and we would make this regiment toe the line, allow it no aristocratic freedom from restraint, and force it to do all the work and persistent hammering, to the end that whenever the king's own was tired and wanted to go off for a change and rummage around amongst ogres and have a good time, it could go without uneasiness, knowing that matters were in safe hands behind it, and business going to be continued at the old stand, same as usual. The king was charmed with the idea. When I noticed that, it gave me a valuable notion. I thought I saw my way out of an old and stubborn difficulty at last. You see, the royalties of the Pendragon stock were a long-lived race and very fruitful. Whenever a child was born to any of these, and it was pretty often, there was wild joy in the nation's mouth and piteous sorrow in the nation's heart. The joy was questionable, but the grief was honest, because the event meant another call for a royal grant. Long was the list of these royalties, and they were a heavy and steadily increasing burden upon the treasury and a menace to the crown. Yet Arthur could not believe this latter fact, and he would not listen to any of my various projects for substituting something in the place of the royal grants. If I could have persuaded him to now and then provide a support for one of these outlying scions from his own pocket, I could have made a grand to-do over it, and it would have had a good effect with the nation. But no, he wouldn't hear of such a thing. He had something like a religious passion for royal grant. He seemed to look upon it as a sort of sacred swag, and one could not irritate him in any way so quickly and so surely as by an attack upon that venerable institution. If I ventured to cautiously hint that there was not another respectable family in England that would humble itself to hold out the hat, however, that is as far as I ever got, he always cut me short there, and peremptorily too. But I believed I saw my chance at last. I would form this crack regiment out of officers alone, not a single private. Half of it should consist of nobles, who should fill all the places up to major general, and serve gratis and pay their own expenses, and they would be glad to do this when they should learn that the rest of the regiment would consist exclusively of princes of the blood. These princes of the blood should range in rank from lieutenant general up to field marshal, and be gorgeously salaried and equipped and fed by the state. Moreover, and this was the master stroke, it should be decreed that these princely grandees should be always addressed by a stunningly gaudy and awe-compelling title, which I would presently invent, and they only in all England should be so addressed. Finally, all princes of the blood should have free choice join that regiment, get that great title, and renounce the royal grant, or stay out and receive a grant. Neatest touch of all, unborn but eminent princes of the blood could be born into the regiment, and start fair, with good wages and a permanent situation, upon due notice from the parents. All the boys would join. I was sure of that, so all existing grants would be relinquished. That the newly born would always join was equally certain. Within 60 days, that quaint and bizarre anomaly, the royal grant, would cease to be a living fact and take its place among the curiosities of the past. Chapter 26. The first newspaper. When I told the king I was going out disguised as a petty freeman to scour the country and familiarize myself with the humbler life of the people, he was all afire with the novelty of the thing in a minute, and was bound to take a chance in the adventure himself. Nothing should stop him. He would drop everything and go along. It was the prettiest idea he had run across for many a day. He wanted to glide out the back way and start at once, but I showed him that that wouldn't answer. You see, he was billed for the king's evil. To touch for it, I mean, and it wouldn't be right to disappoint the house, and it wouldn't make a delay worth considering. Anyway, it was only a one-night stand, and I thought he ought to tell the queen he was going away. He clouded up at that, and looked sad. I was sorry I had spoken. especially when he said mournfully, "Thou forgettest that Launcelot is here, and where Launcelot is, she noteth not the going forth of the king, nor what day he returneth." Of course, I changed the subject. Yes, Guinevere was beautiful, it is true, but take her all around, she was pretty slack. I never meddled in these matters, they weren't my affair, but I did hate to see the way things were going on, and I don't mind saying that much. Many's the time she had asked me, "Sir Boss, hast seen Sir Launcelot about?" But if ever she went fretting around for the king, I didn't happen to be around at the time. There was a very good layout for the king's evil business, very tidy and creditable. The king sat under a canopy of state. About him were clustered a large body of the clergy in full canonicals. Conspicuous, both for location and personal outfit, stood Marinel, a hermit of the quack doctor species, to introduce the sick. All abroad over the spacious floor, and clear down to the doors, in a thick jumble, lay or sat the scrofulous, under a strong light. It was as good as a tableau. In fact, it had all the look of being gotten up for that, though it wasn't. There were 800 sick people present. The work was slow, it lacked the interest of novelty for me, because I had seen the ceremonies before. The thing soon became tedious, but the proprieties required me to stick it out. The doctor was there for the reason that in all such crowds there were many people who only imagined something was the matter with them, and many who were consciously sound but wanted the immortal honor of fleshly contact with a king. And yet others who pretended to illness in order to get the piece of coin that went with the touch. Up to this time this coin had been a wee little gold piece worth about $1/3. When you consider how much that amount of money would buy, in that age and country, and how usual it was to be scrofulous when not dead, you would understand that the annual king's evil appropriation was just the river and harbor bill of that government for the grip it took on the treasury and the chance it afforded for skinning the surplus. So I had privately concluded to touch the treasury itself for the king's evil. I covered 6/7 of the appropriation into the treasury a week before starting from Camelot on my adventures, and ordered that the other 1/7 be inflated into 5-cent nickels and delivered into the hands of the head clerk of the king's evil department. A nickel to take the place of each gold coin, you see, and do its work for it. It might strain the nickel some, but I judged it could stand it. As a rule, I do not approve of watering stock, but I considered it square enough in this case, for it was just a gift anyway. Of course, you can water a gift as much as you want to, and I generally do. The old gold and silver coins of the country were of ancient and unknown origin, as a rule, but some of them were Roman. They were ill-shapen, and seldom rounder than a moon that is a week past the full. They were hammered, not minted, and they were so worn with use that the devices upon them were as illegible as blisters, and looked like them. I judged that a sharp, bright new nickel, with a first-rate likeness of the king on one side of it and Guinevere on the other, and a blooming pious motto, would take the tuck out of scrofula, as handy as a nobler coin, and please the scrofulous fancy more, and I was right. This batch was the first it was tried on, and it worked to a charm. The saving in expense was a notable economy. You will see that by these figures we touched a trifle over 700 of the 800 patients at former rates. This would have cost the government about $240 at the new rate we pulled through for about $35, thus saving upward of $200 at one swoop. To appreciate the full magnitude of this stroke, consider these other figures. The annual expenses of a national government amount to the equivalent of a contribution of 3 days' average wages of every individual of the population, counting every individual as if he were a man. If you take a nation of 60 million, where average wages are $2 per day, 3 days' wages taken from each individual will provide $360 million and pay the government's expenses. In my day, in my own country, this money was collected from imposts, and the citizen imagined that the foreign importer paid it, and it made him comfortable to think so, whereas, in fact, it was paid by the American people, and was so equally and exactly distributed among them that the annual cost to the 100 millionaire and the annual cost to the sucking child of the day laborer was precisely the same. Each paid $6. Nothing could be equaler than that, I reckon. Well, Scotland and Ireland were tributary to Arthur, and the united populations of the British Islands amounted to something less than 1 million. A mechanic's average wage was 3 cents a day, when he paid his own keep. By this rule, the national government's expenses were $90,000 a year, or about $250 a day. Thus, by the substitution of nickels for gold on a king's evil day, I not only injured no one, dissatisfied no one, but pleased all concerned and saved 4/5 of that day's national expense into the bargain, a saving which would have been the equivalent of $800,000 in my day in America. In making this substitution, I had drawn upon the wisdom of a very remote source, the wisdom of my boyhood, for the true statesman does not despise any wisdom. Howsoever lowly may be its origin, in my boyhood I had always saved my pennies and contributed buttons to the foreign missionary cause. The buttons would answer the ignorant savage as well as the coin. The coin would answer me better than the buttons. All hands were happy and nobody hurt. Marinell took the patients as they came. He examined the candidate. If he couldn't qualify, he was warned off. If he could, he was passed along to the king. A priest pronounced the words, "They shall lay their hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Then the king stroked the ulcers. While the reading continued, finally, the patient graduated and got his nickel, the king hanging it around his neck himself, and was dismissed. Would you think that that would cure? It certainly did. Any mummery will cure if the patient's faith is strong in it. Up by Astolat there was a chapel where the Virgin had once appeared to a girl who used to herd geese around there. The girl said so herself, and they built the chapel upon that spot and hung a picture in it representing the occurrence, a picture which you would think it dangerous for a sick person to approach, whereas, on the contrary, thousands of the lame and the sick came and prayed before it every year, and went away whole and sound, and even the well could look upon it and live. Of course, when I was told these things I did not believe them, but when I went there and saw them I had to succumb. I saw the cures affected myself, and they were real cures, and not questionable. I saw cripples whom I had seen around Camelot for years on crutches, arrive and pray before that picture, and put down their crutches and walk off without a limp. There were piles of crutches there which had been left by such people as a testimony. In other places people operated on a patient's mind, without saying a word to him, and cured him. In others, experts assembled patients in a room and prayed over them, and appealed to their faith, and those patients went away cured. Wherever you find a king who can't cure the king's evil, you can be sure that the most valuable superstition that supports his throne, the subject's belief in the divine appointment of his sovereign, has passed away. In my youth, the monarchs of England had ceased to touch for the evil, but there was no occasion for this diffidence. They could have cured it 49 times in 50. Well, when the priest had been droning for 3 hours, and the good king polishing the evidences, and the sick were still pressing forward as plenty as ever, I got to feeling intolerably bored. I was sitting by an open window not far from the canopy of state. For the 500th time a patient stood forward to have his repulsivenesses stroked again. Those words were being droned out, "They shall lay their hands on the sick," when outside there rang clear as a clarion a note that enchanted my soul and tumbled 13 worthless centuries about my ears. Camelot Weekly Hosanna and Literary Volcano. Latest eruption, only 2 cents, all about the big miracle in the Valley of Holiness. One greater than kings had arrived, the newsboy. But I was the only person in all that throng who knew the meaning of this mighty birth, and what this imperial magician was come into the world to do. I dropped a nickel out of the window and got my paper. The Adam Newsboy of the World went around the corner to get my change. Is around the corner yet. It was delicious to see a newspaper again, yet I was conscious of a secret shock when my eye fell upon the first batch of display headlines. I had lived in a clammy atmosphere of reverence, respect, deference, so long that they sent a quivery little cold wave through me. And so on, and so on. Yes, it was too loud. Once I could have enjoyed it and seen nothing out of the way about it, but now its note was discordant. It was good Arkansas journalism, but this was not Arkansas. Moreover, the next to the last line was calculated to give offense to the hermits and perhaps lose us their advertising. Indeed, there was too lightsome a tone of flippancy all through the paper. It was plain I had undergone a considerable change without noticing it. I found myself unpleasantly affected by pert little irreverencies which would have seemed but proper and airy graces of speech at an earlier period of my life. There was an abundance of the following breed of items, and they discomforted me. Local smoke and cinders. Sir Launcelot met up with Old King. A grievance of Ireland unexpectedly last. Weuk over on the moor south of Sir Balmoral Mervilius's hog dasture. The widow has been notified. Expedition No. 3 will start it out the 1st of next month on a search F8R Sir Sagremer le Desirous. It is in com. And of the renowned Knight of the Red Lawns, assisted by Sir Persant of ND, who is compete 9T. Intelligent, court, yes, and in every way a brick and fur. They're assisted by Sir Palamides the Sara Cian, who is no Huckleberry himself. This is no pick nicey, these boys mean business. The readers of the Hosanna will regret to learn that the Haddensum and popular Sir Chirolaus of Gaul, who in his 4-week stay at the Bull and Halibut, this city, has won every heart by his polished manners and elegant CP conversation. We'll pull out today for home. Give us another call, Charlie. The bedeasiness end of the funeral of the late Sir Dalliance, the Duke's son of Cornwall, killed in an encounter with the giant of the knotted bludgeon last Tuesday on the borders of the plain of enchantment was in the hands of the ever affable and efficient Mumble, Prince of when 3 are takers, than whom there exists none by whom it were a more satisfying pleasure to have the last sad offices performed. Give him a trial. The cordial thanks of the Hosanna office are due, from editor down to devil, to the ever courteous and thoughtful Lord High Steward of the palaces, third assistant VT for several sets of ice cream, a quality calculated to make the eye of the recipient's hue mid with guaranteed, and it done it. When this administration wants to chalk up a desirable name for early promotion, the Hosanna would like a chance to suggest the Demoiselle Irene Dewlap of South Astolat is visiting her uncle, the popular host of the Cattlemen's Board in Jose Liver Lane, this city. Young Barker the bellows mender is home again and looks much improved by his vacation roundup among the outlying smithies. See his ad. Of course, it was good enough journalism for a beginning. I knew that quite well, and yet it was somehow disappointing. The court circular pleased me better indeed. Its simple and dignified respectfulness was a distinct refreshment to me after all those disgraceful familiarities. But even it could have been improved. Do what one may, there is no getting an air of variety into a court circular. I acknowledge that. There is a profound monotonousness about its facts that baffles and defeats one's sincerest efforts to make them sparkle and enthuse. The best way to manage in fact, the only sensible way, is to disguise repetitiousness of fact under variety of form. Skin your fact each time and lay on a new cuticle of words. It deceives the eye. You think it is a new fact. It gives you the idea that the court is carrying on like everything. This excites you, and you drain the whole column with a good appetite, and perhaps never notice that it's a barrel of soup made out of a single bean. Clarence's way was good. It was simple. It was dignified. It was direct and business like. All I say is, it was not the best way. However, take the paper by and large, I was vastly pleased with it. Little crudities of a mechanical sort were observable here and there, but there were not enough of them to amount to anything, and it was good enough Arkansas proofreading, anyhow, and better than was needed in Arthur's day and realm. As a rule, the grammar was leaky and the construction more or less lame, but I did not much mind these things. They are common defects of my own, and one mustn't criticize other people on grounds where he can't stand perpendicular himself. I was hungry enough for literature to want to take down the whole paper at this one meal, but I got only a few bites, and then had to postpone. Because the monks around me besieged me so with eager questions. What is this curious thing? What is it for? Is it a handkerchief? Saddle blanket? Part of a shirt? What is it made of? How thin it is, and how dainty and frail, and how it rattles. Will it wear, do you think, and won't the rain injure it? Is it writing that appears on it? Or is it only ornamentation? They suspected it was writing, because those among them who knew how to read Latin and had a smattering of Greek recognized some of the letters, but they could make nothing out of the result as a whole. I put my information in the simplest form I could. It is a public journal. I will explain what that is another time. It is not cloth. It is made of paper. Sometime I will explain what paper is. The lines on it are reading matter, and not written by hand, but printed. By and by I will explain what printing is. 1,000 of these sheets have been made, all exactly like this, in every minute detail. They can't be told apart. Then they all broke out with exclamations of surprise and admiration. 1,000. Verily a mighty work, a year's work for many men. No merely a day's work for a man and a boy. They crossed themselves and whiffed out a protective prayer or two. A miracle, a wonder, dark work of enchantment. I let it go at that. Then I read in a low voice, to as many as could crowd their shaven heads within hearing distance, part of the account of the miracle of the restoration of the well, and was accompanied by astonished and reverent ejaculations all through How true, amazing, Amazing these be the very haps as they happened. In marvelous exactness and might they take this strange thing in their hands, and feel of it, and examine it. They would be very careful. Yes. So they took it, handling it as cautiously and devoutly, as if it had been some holy thing come from some supernatural region, and gently felt of its texture, caressed its pleasant smooth surface with lingering touch, and scanned the mysterious characters with fascinated eyes. These grouped bent heads, these charmed faces, these speaking eyes, how beautiful to me. For was not this my darling, and was not all this mute wonder and interest and homage a most eloquent tribute and unforced compliment to it? I knew, then, how a mother feels when women, whether strangers or friends, take her new baby and close themselves about it with one eager impulse, and bend their heads over it in a tranced adoration that makes all the rest of the universe vanish out of their consciousness and be as if it were not, for that time. I knew how she feels, and that there is no other satisfied ambition, whether of king, conqueror, or poet, that ever reaches halfway to that serene far summit, or yields half so divine a contentment. During all the rest of the séance my paper traveled from group to group all up and down and about that huge hall, and my happy eye was upon it always, and I sat motionless, steeped in satisfaction, drunk with enjoyment. Yes, this was heaven I was tasting at once, if I might never taste it more. Chapter 27. The Yankee and the King travel incognito. About bedtime I took the King to my private quarters to cut his hair and help him get the hang of the lowly raiment he was to wear. The high classes wore their hair banged across the forehead, but hanging to the shoulders the rest of the way around, whereas the lowest ranks of commoners were banged fore and aft. Both the slaves were bangless and allowed their hair free growth. So I inverted a bowl over his head and cut away all the locks that hung below it. I also trimmed his whiskers and mustache until they were only about a half-inch long and tried to do it inartistically, and succeeded. It was a villainous disfigurement. When he got his lubberly sandals on, and his long robe of coarse brown linen cloth, which hung straight from his neck to his ankle bones, he was no longer the comeliest man in his kingdom, but one of the unhandsomest and most commonplace and unattractive. We were dressed and barbered alike, and could pass for small farmers, or farm bailiffs, or shepherds, or carters, yes, or for village artisans, if we chose, our costume being in effect universal among the poor, because of its strength and cheapness. I don't mean that it was really cheap to a very poor person, but I do mean that it was the cheapest material there was for male attire, manufactured material, you understand. We slipped away an hour before dawn, and by broad sunup had made 8 or 10 miles, and were in the midst of a sparsely settled country. I had a pretty heavy knapsack. It was laden with provisions for the King to taper down on, till he could take to the coarse fare of the country without damage. I found a comfortable seat for the King by the roadside, and then gave him a morsel or two to stay his stomach with. Then I said I would find some water for him, and strolled away. Part of my project was to get out of sight and sit down and rest a little myself. It had always been my custom to stand when in his presence, even at the council board, except upon those rare occasions when the sitting was a very long one, extending over hours. Then I had a trifling little backless thing which was like a reversed culvert, and was as comfortable as the toothache. I didn't want to break him in suddenly, but do it by degrees. We should have to sit together now when in company, or people would notice, but it would not be good politics for me to be playing equality with him when there was no necessity for it. I found the water some 300 yards away, and had been resting about 20 minutes, when I heard voices. That is all right, I thought, peasants going to work, nobody else likely to be stirring this early. But the next moment these comers jingled into sight around a turn of the road, smartly clad people of quality, with luggage mules and servants in their train. I was off like a shot, through the bushes, by the shortest cut. For a while it did seem that these people would pass the King before the first could get to him, but desperation gives you wings, you know, and I canted my body forward, inflated my breast, and held my breath and flew. I arrived. And in plenty good enough time, too. Pardon, my King, but it's no time for ceremony. Jump. Jump to your feet, some quality are coming. Is that a marvel? Let them come. But my liege, you must not be seen sitting. Rise, and stand in humble posture while they pass. You are a peasant, you know. True, I had forgot it. So lost was I in planning of a huge war with Gaul. He was up by this time, but a farm could have got up quicker, if there was any kind of a boom in real estate, and right so a thought came randoming over thwart this majestic dream, the which. A humbler attitude, my lord the King, and quick. Duck your head, more, still more. Droop it. He did his honest best, but Lord, it was no great things. He looked as humble as the leaning tower at Pisa. It is the most you could say of it. Indeed, it was such a thundering poor success that it raised wondering scowls all along the line, and a gorgeous flunky at the tail end of it raised his whip, but I jumped in time and was under it when it fell and under cover of the volley of coarse laughter which followed. I spoke up sharply and warned the king to take no notice. He mastered himself for the moment, but it was a sore tax he wanted to eat up the procession. I said. It would end our adventures at the very start, and we, being without weapons, could do nothing with that armed gang. If we are going to succeed in our emprise, we must not only look the peasant but act the peasant. It is wisdom, none can gainsay it. Let us go on, Sir Boss. I will take note and learn, and do the best I may. He kept his word. He did the best he could, but I've seen better. If you have ever seen an active, heedless, enterprising child going diligently out of one mischief and into another all day long, and an anxious mother at its heels all the while, and just saving it by a hair from drowning itself or breaking its neck with each new experiment, you've seen the king in me. If I could have foreseen what the thing was going to be like, I should have said, no, if anybody wants to make his living exhibiting a king as a peasant, let him take the layout. I can do better with a menagerie and last longer. And yet, during the first 3 days I never allowed him to enter a hut or other dwelling. If he could pass muster anywhere during his early novitiate, it would be in small inns and on the road, so to these places we confined ourselves. Yes, he certainly did the best he could, but what of that? He didn't improve a bit that I could see. He was always frightening me, always breaking out with fresh astonishers, in new and unexpected places. Toward evening on the second day, what does he do but blandly fetch out a dirk from inside his robe? Great guns, my liege. Where did you get that? From a smuggler at the inn, yestereve. What in the world possessed you to buy it? We have escaped divers dangers by wit thy wit, but I have bethought me that it were but prudence if I bore a weapon too. Thine might fail thee in some pinch. But people of our condition are not allowed to carry arms. What would a lord say, yes, or any other person of whatever condition, if he caught an upstart peasant with a dagger on his person? It was a lucky thing for us that nobody came along just then. I persuaded him to throw the dirk away, and it was as easy as persuading a child to give up some bright, fresh new way of killing itself. We walked along, silent and thinking. Finally, the king said, When ye know that I meditate a thing inconvenient, or that hath a peril in it, why do you not warn me to cease from that project? It was a startling question, and a puzzler. I didn't quite know how to take hold of it, or what to say, and so of course I ended by saying the natural thing. But, sire, how can I know what your thoughts are? The king stopped dead in his tracks, and stared at me. I believe thou wert greater than Merlin, and truly in magic thou art. But prophecy is greater than magic. Merlin is a prophet. I saw I had made a blunder. I must get back my lost ground. After a deep reflection and careful planning, I said, Sire, I have been misunderstood. I will explain. There are two kinds of prophecy. One is the gift to foretell things that are but a little way off. The other is the gift to foretell things that are whole ages and centuries away. Which is the mightier gift, do you think? Oh, the last, most surely. True. Does Merlin possess it? Partly, yes. He foretold mysteries about my birth and future kingship that were 20 years away. Has he ever gone beyond that? He would not claim more, I think. It is probably his limit. All prophets have their limit. The limit of some of the great prophets has been 100 years. These are few, I ween. There have been two still greater ones, whose limit was 400 and 600 years, and one whose limit compassed even 720. Gramercy, it is marvelous. But what are these in comparison with me? They are nothing. What? Canst thou truly look beyond even so vast a stretch of time as 700 years? My liege, as clear as the vision of an eagle does my prophetic eye penetrate and lay bare the future of this world for nearly 13 centuries and a half. My land, you should have seen the king's eyes spread slowly open and lift the earth's entire atmosphere as much as an inch. That settled Merlin. One never had any occasion to prove his facts. With these people, all he had to do was to state them. It never occurred to anybody to doubt the statement. Now, then, I continued, I could work both kinds of prophecy, the long and the short, if I chose to take the trouble to keep in practice, but I seldom exercise any but the long kind, because the other is beneath my dignity. It is proper to Merlin's sort stump-tail prophets, as we call them in the profession. Of course, I wet up now and then and flirt out a minor prophecy, but not often, hardly ever, in fact. You will remember that there was great talk, when you reached the Valley of Holiness, about my having prophesied your coming in the very hour of your arrival, 2 or 3 days beforehand. Indeed, yes, I mind it now. Well, I could have done it as much as 40 times easier, and piled on 1,000 times more detail into the bargain, if it had been 500 years away instead of 2 or 3 days. How amazing that it should be so. Yes, a genuine expert can always foretell a thing that is 500 years away easier than he can a thing that's only 500 seconds off. And yet, in reason, it should clearly be the other way. It should be 500 times as easy to foretell the last as the first, for indeed, it is so close by that one uninspired might almost see it. In truth, the law of prophecy doth contradict the likelihoods, most strangely making the difficult easy, and the easy difficult. It was a wise head. A peasant's cap was no safe disguise for it. You could know it for a king's under a diving bell, if you could hear it work its intellect. I had a new trade now, and plenty of business in it. The king was as hungry to find out everything that was going to happen during the next 13 centuries, as if he were expecting to live in them. From that time out, I prophesied myself bald-headed, trying to supply the demand. I have done some indiscreet things in my day, but this thing of playing myself for a prophet was the worst. Still, it had its ameliorations. A prophet doesn't have to have any brains. They are good to have, of course, for the ordinary exigencies of life, but they are no use in professional work. It is the restfulest vocation there is. When the spirit of prophecy comes upon you, you merely take your intellect and lay it off in a cool place for a rest, and unship your jaw and leave it alone. It will work itself. The result is prophecy. Every day a knight-errant or so came along, and the sight of them fired the king's martial spirit every time. He would have forgotten himself, sure, and said something to them in a style a suspicious shade or so above his ostensible degree, and so I always got him well out of the road in time. Then he would stand and look with all his eyes, and a proud light would flash from them, and his nostrils would inflate like a war horse's, and I knew he was longing for a brush with them. But about noon of the third day I had stopped in the road to take a precaution, which had been suggested by the whip stroke that had fallen to my share 2 days before, a precaution which I had afterward decided to leave untaken. I was so loath to institute it. But now I had just had a fresh reminder, while striding heedlessly along, with jaw spread and intellect at rest. For I was prophesying, I stubbed my toe and fell sprawling. I was so pale I couldn't think for a moment. Then I got softly and carefully up and unstrapped my knapsack. I had that dynamite bomb in it, done up in wool in a box. It was a good thing to have along. The time would come when I could do a valuable miracle with it, maybe, but it was a nervous thing to have about me, and I didn't like to ask the king to carry it. Yet I must either throw it away or think up some safe way to get along with its society. I got it out and slipped it into my scrip, and just then here came a couple of knights. The king stood stately as a statue, gazing toward them, had forgotten himself again, of course, and before I could get a word of warning out, it was time for him to skip, and well that he did it too. He supposed they would turn aside. Turn aside to avoid trampling peasant dirt underfoot. When had he ever turned aside himself, or ever had the chance to do it, if a peasant saw him or any other noble knight in time to judiciously save him the trouble? The knights paid no attention to the king at all. It was his place to look out himself, and if he hadn't skipped he would have been placidly ridden down, and laughed at besides. The king was in a flaming fury, and launched out his challenge in epithets with a most royal vigor. The knights were some little distance by now. They halted, greatly surprised, and turned in their saddles and looked back, as if wondering if it might be worthwhile to bother with such scum as we. Then they wheeled and started for us. Not a moment must be lost. I started for them. I passed them at a rattling gait, and as I went by I flung out a hair-lifting, soul-scorching 13-jointed insult which made the king's effort poor and cheap by comparison. I got it out of the 19th century, where they know how. They had such headway that they were nearly to the king before they could check up then. Frantic with rage, they stood up their horses on their hind hoofs and whirled them around, and the next moment here they came, breast to breast. I was 70 yards off, then, and scrambling up a great boulder at the roadside. When they were within 30 yards of me, they let their long lances droop to a level, depressed their mailed heads, and so, with their horsehair plumes streaming straight out behind, most gallant to see, this lightning express came tearing for me. When they were within 15 yards, I sent that bomb with a sure aim, and it struck the ground just under the horses' noses. Yes, it was a neat thing, very neat and pretty to see. It resembled a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi, and during the next 15 minutes we stood under a steady drizzle of microscopic fragments of knights and hardware and horseflesh. I say we, for the king joined the audience, of course, as soon as he had got his breath again. There was a hole there which would afford steady work for all the people in that region for some years to come in trying to explain it. I mean, as for filling it up, that service would be comparatively prompt and would fall to the lot of a select few peasants of that seigneury, and they wouldn't get anything for it either. But I explained it to the king myself. I said it was done with a dynamite bomb. This information did him no damage because it left him as intelligent as he was before. However, it was a noble miracle in his eyes and was another settler for Merlin. I thought it well enough to explain that this was a miracle of so rare a sort that it couldn't be done except when the atmospheric conditions were just right. Otherwise, he would be incurring it every time we had a good subject, and that would be inconvenient because I hadn't any more bombs along. Chapter 28. Drilling the King. On the morning of the fourth day, when it was just sunrise, and we had been tramping an hour in the chill dawn, I came to a resolution: the king must be drilled. Things could not go on so. He must be taken in hand, and deliberately and conscientiously drilled. Or we couldn't ever venture to enter a dwelling. The very cats would know this masquerader for a humbug and no peasant. So I called a halt and said, "Sire, as between clothes and countenance you are all right. There is no discrepancy, but as between your clothes and your bearing, you are all wrong. There is a most noticeable discrepancy. Your soldierly stride, your lordly port, these will not do. You stand too straight, your looks are too high, too confident. The cares of a kingdom do not stoop the shoulders, they do not droop the chin, they do not depress the high level of the eye glance. They do not put doubt and fear in the heart, and hang out the signs of them in slouching body and unsure step. It is the sordid cares of the lowly born that do these things. You must learn the trick, you must imitate the trademarks of poverty, misery, oppression, insult, and the other several and common inhumanities that sap the manliness out of a man and make him a loyal and proper and approved subject and a satisfaction to his masters. Or the very infants will know you for better than your disguise, and we shall go to pieces at the first hut we stop at. Pray try to walk like this." The king took careful note, and then tried an imitation. "Pretty fair, pretty fair. Chin a little lower, please, there. Very good. Eyes too high, pray don't look at the horizon. Look at the ground 10 steps in front of you. Ah, that is better. That is very good. Wait, please, you betray too much vigor, too much decision. You want more of a shamble. Look at me. Please, this is what I mean. Now you are getting it. That is the idea, at least it sort of approaches it. Yes, that is pretty fair. But there is a great big something wanting. I don't quite know what it is. Please walk 30 yards, so that I can get a perspective on the thing. Now, then your head's right, speed's right, shoulders right, eyes right, chin right, gait, carriage, general style right, everything's right. And yet the fact remains. The aggregate's wrong. The account don't balance. Do it again, please. Now I think I begin to see what it is. Yes, I've struck it. You see, the genuine spiritlessness is wanting, that's what's the trouble. It's all amateur mechanical details, all right. Almost to a hair, everything about the delusion perfect, except that it don't delude. What, then, must one do to prevail? Let me think. I can't seem to quite get at it. In fact, there isn't anything that can right the matter but practice. This is a good place for it, roots and stony ground to break up your stately gate. A region not liable to interruption, only one field and one hut in sight. And they so far away that nobody could see us from there. It will be well to move a little off the road and put in the whole day drilling you, sire. After the drill had gone on a little while, I said, "Now, sire, imagine that we are at the door of the hut yonder, and the family are before us. Proceed, please accost the head of the house." The king unconsciously straightened up like a monument and said, with frozen austerity, "Varlet, bring a seat and serve to me what cheer ye have." "Ah, your grace, that is not well done." "In what lacketh it?" "These people do not call each other varlets." "Nay, is that true?" "Yes, only those above them call them so." "Then must I try again?" "I will call him Villain." "No, no, for he may be a freeman." "Ah, so. Then peradventure I should call him Goodman." "That would answer, your grace. But it would be still better if you said friend, or brother." "Brother. To dirt like that." "Ah, but we are pretending to be dirt like that too." "It is even true. I will say it. Brother, bring a seat, and thereto what cheer ye have withal. Now 'tis right. Not quite. Not wholly right. You have asked for one, not us for one, not both food for one, a seat for one. The king looked puzzled. He wasn't a very heavy weight, intellectually. His head was an hourglass. It could stow an idea, but it had to do it a grain at a time, not the whole idea at once. Would you have a seat also and sit? If I did not sit, the man would perceive that we were only pretending to be equals and playing the deception pretty poorly too. It is well and truly said. How wonderful is truth, come it in whatsoever unexpected form it may. Yes, he must bring out seats and food for both, and in serving us present not ewer and napkin with more show of respect to the one than to the other. And there is even yet a detail that needs correcting. He must bring nothing outside. We will go in among the dirt, and possibly other repulsive things, and take the food with the household, and after the fashion of the house, and all on equal terms, except the man be of the serf class. And finally, there will be no ewer and no napkin, whether he be serf or free. Please walk again, my liege. There it is better, it is the best yet, but not perfect. The shoulders have known no ignobler burden than iron mail, and they will not stoop. Give me, then, the bag. I will learn the spirit that goeth with burdens that have not honor. It is the spirit that stoopeth the shoulders, I ween, and not the weight, for armor is heavy, yet it is a proud burden, and a man standeth straight in it. Nay, but me no buts, offer me no objections. I will have the thing. Strap it upon my back. He was complete now with that knapsack on, and looked as little like a king as any man I had ever seen. But it was an obstinate pair of shoulders. They could not seem to learn the trick of stooping with any sort of deceptive naturalness. The drill went on, I prompting and correcting. Now, make believe you are in debt, and eaten up by relentless creditors. You are out of work, which is horseshoeing. Let us say, and can get none, and your wife is sick. Your children are crying because they are hungry, and so on and so on. I drilled him, as representing in turn all sorts of people out of luck and suffering dire privations and misfortunes. But Lord, it was only just words. Words, they meant nothing in the world to him. I might just as well have whistled. Words realize nothing, vivify nothing to you, unless you have suffered in your own person the thing which the words try to describe. There are wise people who talk ever so knowingly and complacently about the working classes, and satisfy themselves that a day's hard intellectual work is very much harder than a day's hard manual toil, and is righteously entitled to much bigger pay. Why, they really think that, because they know all about the one, but haven't tried the other. But I know all about both, and so far as I am concerned, there isn't money enough in the universe to hire me to swing a pickaxe 30 days. But I will do the hardest kind of intellectual work for just as near nothing as you can cipher it down, and I will be satisfied too. Intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and is its own highest reward. The poorest paid architect, engineer, general, author, sculptor, painter, lecturer, advocate, legislator, actor, preacher, singer is constructively in heaven when he is at work. And as for the musician with the fiddle bow in his hand, who sits in the midst of a great orchestra with the ebbing and flowing tides of divine sound washing over him, why, certainly he is at work, if you wish to call it that, but Lord, it's a sarcasm just the same. The law of work does seem utterly unfair, but there it is, and nothing can change it. The higher the pay and enjoyment the worker gets out of it, the higher shall be his pay in cash, also. And it's also the very law of those transparent swindles, transmissible nobility and kingship,